Which brings us very nicely into that competition period. So again, looking at our schematic, what you start to see now as we go into competition, that we have got the predominance of the training load is coming from intensity rather than coming from volume. So what do we know? Well, the primary aim of this phase, not surprisingly, is to develop optimal performance. It's the notion of preparedness. So when we think about that notion of supercompensation, you're bringing the fatigue. The aim in the end is to have the fatigue curve low and the athlete preparation curve high. So the whole thing is about athlete preparedness. It's not that we're not trying to produce fatigue, we're still trying to fatigue the athlete, but the end point, the culmination of the competition period is to have the athlete where they've got minimal fatigue and optimal preparedness for competition. The duration is normally 4 to 6 months, and that's because, again, the predominance of training is preparatory. You have a smaller competition period, and then recognizing that you've got to devote some time to the transition period as well. The primary stimulus is intensity, and a lot of that will depend upon the needs of the athlete, also the specifics of the sport. So what we're doing is, as we get closer to the competition, we're driving the intensity up to competition intensities, or even beyond in some of the sessions. We're bringing the volume down. And by bringing the volume down, it allows us to have more recovery. And if we have more recovery, we're going to promote greater biological adaptation. So if we then think about the subdivisions, if we look at the pre-competition phase, well, the objective here is an assessment tool primarily. That's not the only thing, but fundamentally it's the primary thing. It's to really see how has the athlete navigated themselves from the preparatory phase into the competition phase. It's getting them up to competition capability. So they will be doing some less serious, less important competitions in this phase of training. They're not about the primary goal, and you saw that in the overall plan earlier on, that there were competitions dotted throughout. Remember I said it was monocyclic, and that's because the major competition in that example was Paralympics, but they got smaller competitions, because remember, competitions are still classed as training. Even though we are competing, there's still biological strain, biological load being applied. And so you use those competitions fundamentally to prepare the athlete for the major competition in this overall period. But interesting, the stress curve is increasing, and that's primarily not biological. I mean, there is biological because you've got the intensity of the training, but also you've got the psychological. Remember that competitions are by definition stressful. So we have to take that into account, that we have to recognize that as we are getting the athlete closer to the major competition, we're trying to not only bring our biological stress curve down, but we're also trying to bring our cognitive and emotional stress curve down as well. And that will be covered in a subsequent session where we look at the notion of tapering and peaking. If we then look at the competition phase itself, well, it's not surprisingly, it's about the major competition, but it's associated with a high level of induced fatigue. And it comes back to the reinforcing what I was just reflecting upon, is because it's the culmination of both that biological and also emotional fatigue. But it shouldn't be a plateau. It should be an undulating form, because what you're trying to do now is you're trying to get the athlete to move through this competition period, culminating in the major competition, but we're trying not to push them so hard that in essence the wheels, the metaphorical wheels kind of fall off. So what you do is you start to undulate the training a little bit. You undulate this by modulating the intensity and the volume. And so you might have intense weeks with low volume. You might have a slightly higher volume week with a slightly lower intensity. And it allows us just to move the athlete by controlling the fatigue towards the major competition. But overall, the volume is significantly reduced compared to the preparation phase. It's down by 50 to 75%, which allows, therefore, us to really ramp up the intensity to get it close to those competition intensities. But recognize the stress curve is going to be high, because intensity drives greater adaptation because it produces more fatigue. So we've got the fatigue and you've got the emotional fatigue as well. So in our competition period, it's not that we're going to abandon what's going on down here. We're still going to carry on this, but we would have reduced the amount of training, the volume of training in aerobic base, as an example, would decreased, allowing us to bring in this more intense training, which produces different biological adaptations, all of which are important, but allow us to do more intense training because we reduce the overall volume in that period of training.